All right, good morning, class, and welcome to today's presentation about the African slave trade. Now, I know we've talked about history outside of the slave trade, and hopefully, we're going to learn more about modern Africa, but it is important to remember that this is not the only piece of African history. However, it is an important one, especially for those of us that are living with the results of it here in the New World. Now, this can be traumatic for some students, and there's a lot of pain that is told in the story. So if you feel uncomfortable with that, there is a shorter presentation available for you on Google Classroom. So I'm going to take the world studies perspective kind of on today's lesson. You'll also learn a lot about this if you take US history next year or AP US. Sorry. Japan had a little bit going on, but not too much. And then with the spread of Christianity in the Western world, it was considered unchristian to enslave a fellow Christian. So in Europe, it mostly stopped. But the ancient British, the ancient French, and of course the Vikings were enslaving people all over the world. The Vikings, especially, were significant slavers, and today there's an ethnic group called the Slavs that we think, from a ethno-linguistic standpoint, may have got that name from what the Vikings called them as they came and captured them. So yeah, there was a lot of slavery going on in the ancient world. In Europe, it mostly stopped with the spread of Christianity. Now, in West Africa, like in other places, most enslaved people were war captives. You go into a place, you conquer them, or you fight a battle against them. You'd enslave the male soldiers and maybe the female soldiers as well. Now, once enslaved, usually didn't have any rights. It depended on community what the standards of treatment were for different people. And you could be forced to do pretty much anything. You could even be sold like cattle. In some society, they would enslave people that were simply skilled from other communities and they'd work for the king. A lot of people, though, ended up just being farmers. And you have to remember, in these time periods we're talking about, most people are farmers. Cities are smaller and they can only grow so big because agriculture is not that advanced. So a person can work hard enough to feed themselves and then maybe only a few others. So that's what most people are doing, enslaved or free, in all the time we're talking about here. So again, most were farmers. Now, it's really hard to um, summarize what about a West African society in general, even specific ones. We just don't have a lot of knowledge from this time period, but it seems as though there was a different how they recognize wealth. In Europe, there's a big reference or point of view that land ownership is the true measurement of wealth because farming produced so much wealth. In Africa, it was actually owning the means of production, in which case the laborers, which were a sign of wealth instead in many of these kingdoms. So you couldn't necessarily own the land because the land all belonged to the king. But if you could own people who worked the land, you would get your share of the profits from that. Okay. So you can invest by buying enslaved people to help yourself farm more. And this was a system that was pretty well established in many places, but also in Western Africa. Okay, so invest in slavery, and then you can make yourself wealthier. Now, I got to say, though, most of these people, when we're talking about enslaved people in the ancient world, it did not pass generationally. So if you were enslaved, that did not necessarily mean your kids would be enslaved as well. Sometimes it did, but a lot of times it did not. And that's going to be a huge difference in what happens in slavery in the New World. Okay, so there's another slave network that's already going on that exists outside of the one that we're talking about in Europe, the Vikings, and this one involves people of Western Africa. Now, if we remember from our Middle East unit, we had the Islamic rise up that happened over here off the edge of the map, a couple 1,500 miles or so in Mecca. And from there, Muhammad organized the people of Arabia, Southwest Asia, and then they started to expand outward, especially after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. They went into North Africa, swept through Egypt into, do you guys remember your countries? Libya, and then it swept from Libya into Algeria is the big one. We got Tunisia over here as well. We got Morocco over here. And then it also influenced and spread slowly the culture more than anything else into these areas of Western Africa. Now, we are learning about some of the kingdoms that were here last week. You'll recognize some of these cities' names. Timbuktu, we talked about, and Gao. And these places were getting cultural influence from Islam, but also what word am I trying to find here? Material influence. So they're trading things back and forth. And one of the things that these traders want in North Africa to continue to set on these trade routes out to Arabia and beyond is enslaved people. Now, Islam does not outlaw the enslaving of people, neither does Christianity. It did say it's good to free enslaved people, but that did not stop a lot of people from continuing this practice anyway as they traded people up through these routes. And a lot of these enslaved people ended up in Arabia. I taught in Arabia and in Cairo. And in Arabia, I saw a lot of people that looked like they were of African descent, although there may have been a lot of intermarriage with people of Arabian descent. And I think this is how a lot of them, unfortunately, their families ended up here. Now, there's stories about how the Arabs treated their slaves great, and I'm sure that was the case for some of them. There was material concern, but any form of slavery where you're denied human rights and the ability to go where you want to go and make your own decisions is despicable. So I don't like hearing that apology from any kind of slavery that exists in the past, although we will talk about New World slavery as being particularly brutal. Now, over the years, and we're talking, 1,100 years or so, we're looking at 10 million people maybe who were deported out. So we're talking about 10,000 people a year or so who are leaving into the markets of Arabia, which is a slow amount, but it ends up in these kind of epic, unbelievable numbers. And slavery was not officially outlawed in Saudi Arabia until the 1960s. That is Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who is the crown prince and de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia these days. He's my age. And yeah. So, moving on from there, I could talk about Saudi Arabia all day, but I'm going to stay on the topic for now. Around this time, our European pals are out there exploring and they're going for their glory, to spread their Christianity, to obtain knowledge, but most of all, they're going for gold. And we established that there was gold markets in West Africa. They're producing all that gold, those great kingdoms. Think Mansa Musa. So the Europeans showed up in West Africa and they see gold markets and they also see markets for enslaved people. So the markets already existed inside of West Africa, and these markets were terrible things, but you'd often have specialized tribes or specialized groups of people who would raid the interior and capture enslaved people and then take those to the coast to sell to other groups. So the Europeans came in and they were very willing buyers. The store has 10 customers one day, then 20, then 30, then 40. So there's all this money coming in. And the Europeans did have a lot of gold and silver as well. But more than anything, they had weapons and other forms of naval technology and some manufactured goods that were not yet available in Western Africa. So the Europeans would come and trade those things for, unfortunately, enslaved people. And they kind of blew up the market and made more groups turn to specializing in capturing other people from the interior. So it's this European market that's breeding this terrible system. I think in some ways, I mean, it's a terrible comparison to make. There's a lot of similarities or parallels between this system and kind of the American drug industry these days, with the American appetite for illicit drugs driving up production of them in these Latin American countries, and then they have to bear a lot of the consequences. This was a similar thing that's happening here, except even more terrible product, of course, is they're selling people. People. We got to remember, for the numbers we're looking at here, each one of these people had a story. They had a life. They had family. They had friends. And so this is okay, focus. Moving on. All right. When the arrivals of the Europeans and the demand for slaves in America, like I said, the slave trade expanded dramatically, got bigger. Okay. Now, over in Europe, there was not a lot of slavery after the spread of Christianity, which Christianity got third, fourth century, it starts taking over the Mediterranean. And then by the 8th, ninth century, it's stamping out the last bits of pagandom in northern Eastern Europe, where they're worshiping the old ways, the old gods. And as Christianity spread, it pretty much got rid of slavery inside of Europe. Instead, they had their feudal system in which nobles owned the land and people worked on the land. And some would have forms of serfdom, which was terrible, where you kind of belonged to the land, but you still had rights as a person, not freedom of speech or any of those great rights we have today. But you can kind of do what you want as long as what you wanted to do was be a farmer on a piece of property. So, not a great system, but certainly not slavery. And in Western Europe, especially at this time, England, Spain, the Netherlands, there's a growing market of labor for cash, labor for money, which today we'll call capitalism. So, not a lot of slaves inside of Europe at the time of this European exploration. So when the Europeans came to the New World, there was a lot of people already living there, and these people were the Native Americans. The Spanish and Portuguese, like we learned about before, the conquistadors, of course, first enslaved the Native Americans and forced them to do the work of collecting gold. We talked about those terrible stories of Columbus, and if you didn't bring him his portion of gold, chopping off hands and things like that. So they did this to the Native Americans, and in many of the islands, they completely wiped them out. Now, on the continent, a lot of the Native American people who were enslaved would figure out a way to escape and run away to their comrades who were free in the interior. But the big reason why this form of slavery did not last is unfortunately the super tragic one we've mentioned so many times throughout the year, disease, and at a scale much, much greater than this COVID 19 disease. The big one being smallpox. Oh, yeah, warning, terrible picture alert. So, the Native Americans we've talked about never had any contact with European diseases before. They didn't have any kind of immunity for it. And as a result, the populations would be devastated, with up to 95% of some places killed off by disease and slaughter and enslavement. So, the disease was the biggest factor, but all the other things the Europeans are doing are exacerbating and making this worse for the Native American people. There is smallpox, which forms those poxes or pustules upon your body. Again, it gets inside of your lungs and bursts and causes you to starve to death. So, not starve to death, but drown in your own lungs. Okay. And we got to remember that when we're talking about how easy, relatively, it was for the Europeans to come in and take over these places and install their systems upon it. There is more smallpox baby, with those terrible marks upon it. Again, today we have a vaccine for smallpox. You probably didn't get it because you were born after a time we declared victory over smallpox. Hopefully, we're right. We haven't had any cases in the wild in I think like 30 something years, but there are a couple of vials of it in the CDC laboratory, and I think the Russians have some as well. Okay, so as in the New World, the Spanish conquered more and more territories, as the Portuguese did as well. They began relying on imported slaves from Africa. And in 1518, this is the first shipment we're aware of, specifically of enslaved people that went directly from West Africa to the Caribbean, where the slaves worked on sugar plantations. Now, there also the very next year, I believe in 1519, we have evidence now of the first slave ship or the first enslaved people, Africans, arrived in Jamestown, which had been founded just a few years earlier than this. And the ship was called the White Lion, and there was recently a big feature in the New York Times about it, celebrating, or not celebrating, but commemorating 500 years after the first enslaved people in the United States. So the very first successful town in America, Jamestown, had slaves in it from almost the very beginning. So the Caribbean, though, is where most of them are going to go at the start to grow sugar, this very valuable commodity that could not be produced in Europe and could not be produced in the same numbers for the right price from the Arabs. So the Europeans wanted to grow their own sugar as they got addicted to it. By 1520s, now we're talking about the conquest of the Aztec and the Inca. They're introducing slaves to all these places where they force them to work as agriculturalists, cultivators, as well as in the mines collecting the silver and gold. And then in large numbers, by 1600s, they had more and more slavery in British North America. But as I previously mentioned, we've now learned that slavery goes back in Jamestown to at least 1519. Now, this is all part of this triangular trade system. So I'm just going to go to the picture real quick. You can look at this later on and then show you the picture. Okay. So from Britain and other places in Europe, they are making manufactured goods. Okay. Stuff you can make in factories: pots, pans, guns, alcohol. They also have lots of horses and things like that. And then also the profits they're making from this entire thing. They would take a lot of those goods down here to West Africa, in which they would buy people and other items, luxury items like ivory and teak wood and things like that. And they would then, unfortunately, send those enslaved people on European ships to the Americas, especially Brazil, the Caribbean, and a little bit, but in large enough numbers to create the populations we have today, of course, numbers to British North America as well. In the New World, these enslaved people would be part of an economic system where they would be the ones in the fields growing the crops needed to make sugar, cotton, rum, tobacco, coffee. All these goods then be shipped off back to Europe, which would then continue the system over and over again. The Europeans are also sending these goods, they're sending to Africa, to the New World as well. We call this the triangular trade, and for the Europeans, it's kind of the first real global trade network they're a part of. This is a old map showing this, okay? And this is actually based on a real map, excuse me, voyage that was taken in 1752. So this is before the United States was the United States, but we are the English colonies. And Newport, Rhode Island, they're coming and they're carrying rum on one way of the journey. They are then selling that rum and they've bought some gold. We know that West Africa produces a lot of gold, some pepper as well, a spice they would like to use to flavor food, especially rotten food and stuff like that in the colonies. And unfortunately, 56 enslaved people. They then sail up to Barbados. And in Barbados, they make the trade to hogsheads of molasses. Molasses is a sugar type product that you then turn into rum, which they then carry back to Africa. They also have sugar, which they're going to get from down here, money, okay? And that money is going to go eventually back to Europe. So you can see this kind of trade route going on. People, unfortunately, are considered a product, and the more you would invest in people, the more of these valuable agricultural goods you could produce. So yeah, it's a terrible system, and it made a lot of people really wealthy. And when we talk about the wealth that built the United States and other places, this is a huge part of it. Why is Europe so nice? They are making a lot of money off of slavery. Now, where are the enslaved people going? So most of them are going to the Caribbean and to South America. So obviously we see there's a significant number that does go to the British colonies of the United States. And if you are African American, in that your people are of African descent who have been in America for many generations, unless you know of their immigration from Africa after 1865, there's a good chance your ancestors, unfortunately, were enslaved people inside of the United States. Now, the number may look small on there, But that's a huge number of people when you consider how small the European population was in the US at the time. In the South, many of the states, the enslaved people outnumbered the people of European descent. Now, of course, African Americans would play such a giant contribution in creating the country and everything else, but you'll learn all about that stuff in U.S. history next year. Now, let's look at the Caribbean for a second. The West Indies, as they're calling it here. Remember, Columbus was looking for the Indies, he found the wrong ones. Um, you see 4.5 million people. So if you look at islands like Jamaica, which is where my wife's people are from, or Cuba, which has a significant population of African people. Jamaica is almost entirely of African people, as are places like Barbados and other islands. You'll see why from here. Haiti, we talked about their slave revolt that they had there, where they established their independence as well. You see less people going to Central America and less people going to Peru and to Argentina. You also see 5 million people going to South America, especially in Brazil. So Recife, Salvador, Rio de Janeiro, and then Buenos Aires is part of Argentina. They're going to work in these coffee fields as well as sugar plantations and on the coast owned by the people from Portugal, making this tremendous profit off this. So if you are African American, your people more than likely came from West Africa and were imported here as slaves. And again, a lot of these people on the coast, the African people, were making money off of this, of enslaving people further in the interior. And we see these numbers, 1650s, an approximate start, although this is going on a little bit earlier than that, to 1860. There was still some slave importing going on in Brazil even after that. And during the Civil War, I think someone even tried to bring slaves in the United States. But really, after about 1830, the British did a big effort to try to shut down the slave trade in this part of the world. Now, the next part is kind of painful, and this lecture is already going super long. So, yeah, okay, well, let's get through. The original capture of slaves was almost always violent. No one is willingly captured and taken into slavery. And as European demand grew, the chieftains would organize raiding parties to get more people to be enslaved and sold to the Europeans. Others would launch wars specifically to create the conditions in which they could capture more enslaved people. Now, after they were captured, these people were, of course, forced in this thing called the Middle Passage, which is when they went across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the conditions on the ships were terrible. Of the people who made it to the coast and were starting to be put in the process of becoming enslaved, only about 50% in many of the time we're talking about would actually make it to the New World. Now, some of them would die on the Middle Passage from the conditions. A lot of them, though, would choose kind of to die. There's all these stories of people just refusing to eat and just letting the life go out of them because they knew what the next steps on the journey were. Many people would jump off the coast. People would die trying to escape. So terrible, terrible, terrible. And then you'd have to be trapped on these ships. Now, most of the ships, you could sit upright, but not necessarily stand because they'd stack the people. Others would force slaves to lie in chairs with barely 20 inches space between them. Here's some diagrams. This is an artist rendition of what they think it might have looked like. I have a hard time like reconciling this with humanity. And if you watch the movie Amistad, which I'll put up some clips from that in my YouTube video collection, they kind of show some other conditions on the ship and what it might have looked like, but just about as nightmarish and hellish as you could imagine. So they would try to keep slaves alive as a way of maximizing profit, but the treatment was so cruel. And throughout this whole system, violence is always a constant part of it. Okay. And some slaves that refused to eat would have to have their mouths pried open and food be force fed on them to try to keep them alive. And sometimes, if a slave was showing signs of infection, they'd throw him overboard to stop infection from spreading. And so death rates could be as high as 50%. Eventually, not considering those that killed themselves, it declined a lot in later years because they were able to get such a large amount of money for these enslaved people. Now, in the 1600s, can take maybe 30 to 50 days to sail from Angola in West Africa to Brazil, both Portuguese colonies. It took a little bit longer between the different colonies of the Caribbean and further north in West Africa, so 60 to 90 days. And these times would go down a little bit, but we're always talking about extended journeys across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, when you got to the New World, you'd often be taken off the ship, and the people would be placed in a pen. They'd be washed, sometimes greased up, so they would look better. Think about muscle builders putting like baby oil on today, and try to make them look as healthy and as possible, so they can be sold for as much as possible. They'd oftentimes be branded as well, which is when you take a hot iron and heat it up and force it into the skin, causing a permanent scar. And this brand would be used to identify them as belonging to a certain people or from a certain port of entry. So this is from a guy who mispronounced his name, Oladu Iquano, and we're going to read some of him in the DBQ that I'm going to post at some point in time. So here he's talking about what it was like to be appearing for the first time. We were not many days in the merchant's custody before we were sold after their usual manner. On a signal given, as at the beat of a drum, buyers rush at once into the yard where the slaves are confined, and make a choice of the parcel they like best. The noise and clamor with which this is attended, and the eagerness visible in the countenance of the buyers, serve not a little to increase the apprehension of terrified Africans. In this manner, without scruple, our relations and friends separated, most of them never to see each other again. I remember in the vessel which I was brought over, there were several brothers who, in the sale, were sold in different lots. And it was very moving on this occasion to see and hear their cries in parting. So it's talking about the slave sale and like the brothers getting separated, which sometimes was often done on purpose. Now, there's always some people, like we'll say Kanye West, because he said some dumb stuff last year that slavery was a choice. And there's always people say, well, how did the slaves allow this to happen? Why did they fight back? Well, okay, they did. They fought back every step of the way, and there's tales of people freeing themselves and escaping and killing their masters all up and down throughout the history of slavery. Those histories, though, were tried to be contained and hidden by the slave masters because they didn't want the message to spread. Now, there were some other specifically evil techniques that were used, and the Nazis would actually use a lot of these techniques as well when they commit their genocide during World War II, and that people who showed leadership were usually killed right away. If people were turning to them and treating them like the big boss, the big man, it was often better for the enslavers to kill that person than to deal with that person as a threat to them in their power structure. And oftentimes, families were purposely broken up, and they try to break up people who spoke the same languages because they didn't want them to be able to work together, anyways, against the masters. And violence, violence, violence. Extreme brutality to keep the slaves living in fear of what might happen to them. And violence on a scale that's been depicted in media. And I think we're going to put up Roots at some point this week for you guys to check out. Um, man, but the violence we're talking about is just an evil, sadistic level that it's hard for us to comprehend here in our present day and age, although I know there is still terrible things that happen today. So auctions were often held to sell the people, and they would inspect the slaves to see how old they are, see their value, maybe show off their physical strength, do some squats, push-ups, things like that. Just terrible, terrible things. And it got bigger and bigger over time. But late 15th and 16th century, about 2,000 Africans were exported each year, and 20,000 a year in the next century. And then in the 18th century, which is the 1700s, 55,000 people per year. Then it gets bigger. This is when America is first becoming a country, 88,000 per year. More than 12 million, we think, Africans were transported to the New World via the Atlantic slave trade. a lot more died, millions more died resisting capture before they got to the New World. Once they arrived in the New World, the most likely destination for them was a plantation. Um, and these it just means a large farm. Now in America, they have the connotation of also being slave plantations, which is always why when people say they're having a plantation wedding, I'm like, really? You're gonna have a wedding where there was probably slavery, especially in the South? Whatever, mind my own business. But at the time, they usually build these giant plantations in the southern reaches of the United States or in the Caribbean, tropical, subtropical areas where it's hot. And the Spanish had them early on. Sugar was the biggest thing, and this was exported back to Europe and also around the world. Also made other things. Tobacco was a big one in the United States. Think North Carolina. Indigo, which is a kind of dye, and of course cotton, which would be huge in the American South, especially in the early 19th century. These are all crops that people were trying to export to make a profit, so they weren't really being kept there for the most part. And it needed the slave labor to make them this profitable. Only if you could barely pay people, and by pay people I mean keep them alive, could you really get the kind of wealth that was being taken out of the land. You don't have to pay your workforce, you can profit from everything they do. So this was a very profitable system for the landowners who often didn't even live on the plantations. They'd be off in Europe and have people manage the plantations for them to keep their hands clean of all the day-to-day violence and travesties and degradation of humanity that would happen when they weren't there. This is, of course, a photo that was taken, I believe, in the United States after the Civil War, and those are just keloid marks from all of the whippings he received from their slave masters. Now, I don't really want to talk about all the individual things they would do to enslave people, but there's lots of resources online if you want to know some of the tortures they would do in order to keep people in the position they wanted them in. Okay, now in North America, which is we're talking about the United States and a little bit Canada, not very much at all. It wasn't as tropical, so we didn't have as bad of diseases. And they viewed it more of an investment of not trying just to work them to death as quickly as possible, which is kind of what was happening in the Caribbean and in South America. And so there was more of an emphasis on like, you're going to be generational here, and then let's make as much wealth as possible off of your children, which is a terrible facet of American slavery as they saw them. Not only do you have to work for us, we expect you to make lots of kids that we might sell off to other plantation owners and earn a profit off of that. So not that many of the people who went to North America, but because of the conditions here, they created a very substantial population. We looked at this chart earlier. Okay. Now, of our first 12 presidents, 12, 10 of them owned slaves. Okay. The two that did not were John Adams, who was the second president, and his son, John Quincy Adams, who I believe was the fourth or fifth president. Both of them were abolitionists and against slavery. I'm also going to give Martin Van Buren, our eighth president, a little bit of slack because he inherited a slave, but he tried to sell it as quickly as possible, and then later on joined the Free Soil Party, which became the Republican Party. But the rest of them, yeah, slave owners. And it's really hard to reconcile for some people with these people they were taught to see as heroes and the fact that they were slave owners. I'll let your U.S. history teachers deal with that more, but they all did terrible things. And I don't know how they slept at night with what was happening by their responsibility, and oftentimes very personally by their own hand. Okay, so slaves did resist in many ways. There was work slowages and stoppages, work slowdowns and stoppages, as well as sabotage of the products and the tools. Also, run away and escape, okay? Especially in the Caribbean, there's lots of these maroon communities. There's some of them in Florida as well, where people would escape and build their own kind of towns. There's a bunch of really famous ones in Brazil and also in Jamaica and Venezuela, where they built their own cities pretty much, and they still have that heritage there today. You can visit communities that were founded by runaway peoples. Okay, they would also revolt. Okay, we're not going to talk about it in this presentation, but we looked at Haiti, and there's other places where they was rise up against them. Fortunately, not as successful. So the threat of all the slaves rising up was always present in the masters' minds. Okay, and unfortunately, the revolts were usually crushed quickly and extremely violently. And all the slave masters would join together to crush any revolt in any area near them because they didn't want their slaves getting an idea that this was possible. So the impact, we'll kind of leave off here for the most part. Um, the impact of the slave trade in Africa itself. Well, it did a lot of things besides bring about a tradition of capturing and enslaving different tribes and creating all this distrust among many of the tribes in West Africa that still kind of exist today. It also distorted the gender balances. So most of the exported slaves were male, leaving behind more female communities. So a lot of men ages 14 to 35. So they kind of hollow out like the most productive years of young men. And it led to some strange practices. A lot of polygamy was going on, which is not that strange in world history, but we think it's kind of weird today. And it also led actually to some more matrilineal power. That means like female led power in some of these communities because the women had to kind of rise up and fill the role left over from some of these men. Okay. And, some places in Africa, didn't get hit that hard because of where they were. Some places got hit extremely hard because of where they were. Senegal, which is kind of right in the coast of West Africa, there going up to the Sahel, had a lot of people captured from there. Some people got rich off of selling people in Western Africa. Some tribes made themselves incredibly wealthy and powerful. Eventually some people fought in Africa to keep it. Now, there's always this question of like, why would they do this to their own people? In their minds, it wasn't their own people. In the United States today and kind of around the world, we have this philosophy of like, I am a white person or I'm a black person, I'm a shared heritage of these people, or I am an American or I am Japanese. Back then, it was much more tribal. I am a Maasai. I am Ojibwe. And they would recognize themselves based on their tribal groups and didn't have this global unity of we're African, we should stop slavery together. It's more my people are profiting off of selling these people. On a whole, it was really destructive and bad for African society. Now, the colonialism that comes kind of at the end of the slave trade was probably more destructive on Africa itself. But think about the people. Every one of these people had a story, a tale, family, friends, thoughts, feelings that were shattered by this practice. And oftentimes, generations upon generations of people suffered through these practices. So, 25 million people, maybe, enslaved out of Africa during a long time period. That's a significant amount. Whew. Sorry, I'm trying to keep it together here. I know I've gone really long in this presentation. So, eventually, good foods from the United States like peanuts and other things like potatoes would arrive and would change things in Africa as well. So, we'll talk more about modern issues in Africa later on in class, but I just wanted to give this presentation today about our stuff going on with the slave trade. I hope you guys enjoyed this presentation and the video. I apologize if it doesn't come out that well, but I look forward to hearing from you guys soon.